Police lights flooded the front of a high school for what dispatch called an active threat. The language was urgent, violent, imminent. Officers arrived expecting chaos, someone barricaded, armed, dangerous. What they found instead was silence. A spotless hallway, and a 16-year-old boy sitting alone in a chair, hands open, waiting. This is the moment where stories split in two. One version, spoken into a phone by an administrator behind glass, described terror and aggression. The other version, captured by a body camera, showed stillness, exhaustion, and a child who had already learned that survival sometimes means not moving at all. This isn't a story about a school emergency. It's about how fear becomes fact when authority speaks first, and how a camera, quietly recording, exposed the distance between what was reported and what was real. The crimson and sapphire strobe lights of the patrol unit bounced rhythmically off the damp brickwork of Northwood High, casting long, erratic shadows that danced against the institution's imposing facade like nervous ghosts. It was 10:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, a time when the hallways should have been echoing with the chaotic symphony of locker doors slamming and the shuffling of sneakers. But today the silence was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Officer Miller adjusted the Velcro strap on his tactical vest, feeling the familiar grounding weight of the ceramic plate against his chest, a sensation that usually brought comfort but now only served to heighten the dissonance of the moment. The dispatch call had been breathless, a chaotic transmission fractured by static and panic, describing an active threat and an aggressive male subject who had barricaded himself in the main administrative corridor. The terminology used by the caller, words like violent, terrorizing, and imminent danger, had painted a mental portrait of a heavily armed assailant or a student in the throes of a psychotic break, priming every muscle in Miller's body for a life-or-death confrontation. He placed his hand on the cold steel of the door handle, took a sharp intake of the sterile, floor-wax-scented air, and prepared to enter a war zone. But the war zone did not exist. As the heavy double doors swung open, Miller and his partner swept into the hallway, weapons drawn but held at the low ready, their boots squeaking sharply against the polished linoleum. The sensory details of the scene hit Miller not with the force of an explosion, but with the eerie confusion of a surrealist painting. There was no screaming. There was no overturned furniture. There was no shattered glass. Instead, the hallway stretched out before them, pristine and undisturbed, bathed in the hum of fluorescent lighting that flickered with a clinical indifference. At the far end of the corridor, near the trophy case that boasted decades of athletic glory, sat a single wooden chair, and in that chair sat the threat. He was a boy, no older than 16, wearing a faded hooded sweatshirt and jeans that had seen better days. He was not pacing. He was not shouting. He was not holding a weapon. His hands were resting openly on his knees, palms up, in a universal gesture of submission and exhaustion. The juxtaposition between the frantic voice on the radio and the stillness of the boy was so jarring that Miller felt a momentary vertigo, a glitch in his processing of reality. To the left, behind the reinforced glass of the main office, a face appeared, pale, distorted by hysteria, mouthing words that the thick glass swallowed whole. It was the administrator, the author of the 911 call. She was pointing frantically at the boy, her gestures sharp and accusatory, mimicking the recoil of a firearm. She clutched a phone to her ear with a white-knuckled grip, her eyes wide with a fear that seemed to have no correlation to the physical reality of the hallway. Miller's body camera, the silent, unblinking third eye clipped to the center of his chest, was already recording. It was capturing the black tax in high definition, the exorbitant emotional cost paid by the boy for merely existing in a space where his presence was interpreted as a provocation. The camera saw what the administrator refused to see. The boy's shoulders were slumped not in aggression, but in defeat. His eyes were not wild with rage. They were glazed over with the profound weariness of someone who had been expecting this arrival his entire life. The gap between the administrator's internal narrative of danger and the objective truth of the boy's stillness was a chasm, and standing on the edge of that chasm was Miller. He lowered his weapon slightly, the barrel dipping toward the floor as the cognitive dissonance settled in. The adrenaline that had spiked in response to the word, threat, began to curdle into something colder and more cynical. The atmosphere in the hallway was thick with an unvoiced accusation, but it wasn't coming from the boy. It was coming from the architecture itself, from the frantic woman behind the glass, from the system that had dispatched armed agents of the state to handle a child sitting in a chair. Miller took a step forward, his boots heavy, the sound echoing like a gavel strike in an empty courtroom. He wasn't just walking toward a suspect, he was walking into the middle of a story that had been written long before he arrived, a story where fear rewrote reality in real time. The boy looked up, and for a split second, his eyes met the lens of the body camera, acknowledging the digital witness that would soon expose the terrifying quietude of the truth. The silence that hung in the school vestibule following the officer's entry was not the peaceful quiet of a library, but the pressurized, suffocating stillness of a bomb disposal unit where one wrong move could detonate the air itself. Officer Miller stood at the threshold of the administrative office, his hand hovering near his belt, his mind trying to reconcile the hysterical dispatch audio playing in his earpiece with the visual reality before him. The dispatch had painted a picture of chaotic aggression, of a student out of control, a physical menace that required immediate law enforcement intervention to restore order. Yet, the scene captured by the unblinking eye of his body camera was unnervingly static. There was no overturned furniture. There was no shouting. There was only a 13-year-old boy sitting on a plastic chair, his hands resting visibly on his knees, his posture rigid not with aggression, but with a terrifying, disciplined stillness that no child should have to master. This visual dissonance is the first tremor of the counterstory we are about to uncover. It introduces us to a concept that sociologists and cultural critics have long identified, yet which rarely makes it into the police reports: the black tax. This is not a financial transaction, but an emotional and psychological surcharge levied on marginalized individuals, requiring them to perform an exaggerated version of safety just to survive the mundane interactions of daily life. In this frozen moment, we witness the tax being paid in real time. The boy knows, with an intuition far beyond his years, that he cannot afford the luxury of a normal human reaction. He cannot be indignant. He cannot be confused. He cannot even be scared, for fear is often misread as guilt, and confusion is misinterpreted as resistance. The heavy, frantic breathing coming from behind the reception desk, where the administrator had barricaded herself, stood in stark contrast to the boy's unnatural calm. She was allowed to be terrified of a phantom. He was required to be stoic in the face of a gun. This dynamic creates a tension that is almost audible on the recording, a high-pitched frequency that speaks to the historical weight pressing down on the linoleum floor. The administrator saw a threat not because of what the boy was doing, but because of what she projected onto him. Her perception was the weapon, and the police were merely the ammunition she had called in to fire it. This brings us to the central mystery of this footage, an open loop that we must close over the course of this analysis. How does a quiet student sitting in a chair transform into a level 1 threat in the mind of an educator? To understand the horrifying gap between the dispatch call and the body camera footage, we have to dismantle the machinery of this interaction. We cannot simply look at the surface, we must excavate the underlying architecture of the school-to-prison pipeline. Over the next few minutes, we will examine 3 specific narrative pillars that define this encounter, 3 lessons that this boy had clearly internalized before Officer Miller ever walked through those double doors. First, we will explore the defense of excellence, the armor one must wear to deflect suspicion. Second, we will decode the subtle art of code switching, the linguistic gymnastics required to de-escalate authority figures who are already primed for conflict. And finally, we will arrive at the receipts, the irrefutable logical win provided by the body camera itself, which acts as the only impartial witness in a room filled with bias. The tension in the room was palpable because everyone involved was operating from a different script. The officer was prepared for a fight that didn't exist. The administrator was living in a horror movie of her own invention. And the boy was trapped in a tragedy written by history. As Miller took another step forward, the crunch of his boot on the floor broke the silence, but it didn't break the tension. If anything, it pulled the wire tighter. The boy didn't flinch. He didn't run. He simply waited, paying the tax with his silence, hoping that the currency of his compliance would be enough to purchase his survival for one more afternoon. This is the sophisticated, dignified, yet utterly heartbreaking reality of the counter-story. While the official report would later list this as a misunderstanding, The body camera reveals it as something far more sinister, a collision of two worlds, where one person's imaginary fear becomes another person's very real danger. The officer cleared his throat, ready to speak, and in that split second before the first word was uttered, the entire weight of the system hung in the balance, suspended between the panicked fiction of the accuser and the stoic truth of the accused. The fluorescent lights hummed a low, electric drone above the checkered linoleum of the hallway, a sound that usually signaled the mundane transition between third and fourth period but now felt like the pressurized silence of a courtroom before a verdict is read. The officer stood 7 feet away, a distance that felt simultaneously like a chasm and a knife edge, his boots squeaking slightly as he adjusted his stance to something tactical, something prepared for violence. Behind him, peering through the reinforced safety glass of the main office, the administrator watched with the frantic self-righteousness of someone who believes they have just saved the day, unaware that she had merely set a stage for a tragedy of errors. The boy, Marcus, did not drop his bag. He did not raise his hands in the universal gesture of surrender, for he knew that in the twisted logic of this environment, a sudden movement of surrender could be misinterpreted as the wind-up to an attack. Instead, he stood with the unnatural stillness of a statue, a posture he had not learned in the classroom, but had rehearsed in the living room under the terrified tutelage of a father who knew that excellence was the only shield that could deflect a bullet. This was the first pillar of his survival mechanism engaging in real time, the defense of excellence. It is a burden unique to those who are policed before they are greeted, the requirement to be not just innocent, but unimpeachable. Marcus knew that being an average teenager, confused and annoyed, was a luxury he could not afford. To survive this encounter without handcuffs or worse, he had to instantly transform into a scholar, a diplomat, and a lawyer, all while his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The officer finally spoke, his voice clipped and laced with the adrenaline of a dispatch call that had promised an active threat. He demanded to see what was in the side pocket of the backpack, the object that Mrs. Gable had described as a metallic improvised weapon, a description that had sent 3 squad cars screaming toward the magnet school. Marcus moved with agonizing slowness. He narrated his actions before he took them, a habit forced upon him by a world that viewed his silence as defiance and his movement as aggression. He announced that he was reaching for his AP Physics project, a statement that hung in the air, clashing violently with the narrative the officer had been fed. When his hand emerged, it did not hold a knife, nor a pipe, nor a firearm. It held a custom-machined aluminum chassis for a remote-controlled rover, a piece of engineering elegance that caught the harsh overhead light and gleamed with innocent precision. The body camera, blinking its silent red eye, captured this moment of jarring cognitive dissonance. It recorded the precise millisecond where the officer's brain had to reconcile the suspect, a black male reported for dangerous behavior, with the reality standing before him, an honors student holding a tangible proof of his intellect. But the defense of excellence is not merely about possessing the object, it is about the performance of articulation. Marcus did not stutter. He did not use slang. He switched codes with a fluidity that was both impressive and heartbreaking. He began to explain the tensile strength of the aluminum, the function of the chassis in his robotics competition, and the reason he was carrying it to the lab during his lunch break. He used words like torque, velocity, and schematic, wielding his vocabulary like a weapon of de-escalation. He was proving his right to exist in that hallway by proving his intelligence, paying a toll that no other student would have been asked to pay. The officer's posture began to soften, not because he was kind, but because the narrative of the thug was dissolving under the relentless, calm brilliance of the boy. The bodycam footage shows the officer's hand drift away from his holster, the tension leaking out of his shoulders as the realization of the mistake began to take root. Yet, in the background, the administrator remained behind the glass, her narrative of fear still intact in her mind, even as the reality of excellence dismantled it in the hallway. This interaction reveals the crushing weight of the black tax in its most acute form. Excellence is not just a pursuit for Marcus, it is a survival strategy. If he had been less articulate, if he had been a student with a less impressive project, if he had been angry instead of poised, the outcome might have been catastrophic. He had to be extraordinary just to be treated as safe. The camera captured the officer leaning in, looking at the aluminum part, asking a genuine question about the project, the dynamic shifting from predator and prey to adult and student. But the tragedy lies in the shift itself. Marcus had to audit for his humanity. He had to present his credentials, his intelligence, his diction, his project, to purchase the safety that should have been free. As the officer nodded, conceding that there was no threat, the silence returned to the hallway, but it was no longer the silence of impending doom. It was the heavy, exhausted silence of a test passed, a performance concluded, and a child who had aged 10 years in 10 minutes, standing alone with his excellence, while the system that called the police on him watched from behind the safety glass, unrepentant and safe. Dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light that cut across the linoleum floor of the hallway, indifferent to the precipice upon which Marcus stood. The air conditioner hummed a low, mechanical drone that seemed to vibrate against his ribcage, a constant reminder of the physical world while his mind retreated into a fortress of absolute calculation. This was the moment where the second pillar of his survival architecture had to be deployed, a mechanism he had practiced not in front of a mirror, but in the crucible of grocery stores, sidewalks, and crowded elevators since he was 12 years old. It was the internal volume knob, a psychological device that allowed him to modulate his very existence to a frequency that did not trigger the predator response in the armed men standing before him. The administrator's report had painted a picture of chaotic aggression, of a looming threat that required immediate neutralization, but the reality captured by the cold, unblinking eye of the bodycam was a study in stillness. Marcus felt the adrenaline flooding his system, the ancient fight-or-flight response screaming at him to run or to defend his honor, but he reached into the control room of his mind and slowly, deliberately, turned the master fader down. He visualized his own presence shrinking, his mass becoming less dense, his gravity less pulling. He knew that in this ecosystem, volume was equated with guilt and sudden movement was interpreted as a death wish. Therefore, his survival depended on becoming a void, a space where the officer's anxiety could find no purchase. The officer's hand was still resting near his holster, a tactile connection to lethal force that Marcus tracked with peripheral vision while keeping his head perfectly still. He adjusted his posture, not to a slouch which could be read as disrespect, and not to a rigid stance which could be read as aggression, but to a calculated neutrality. His shoulders dropped exactly 1 inch. His hands, open and empty, remained visible at his sides, palms turned slightly outward in the universal gesture of surrender, offering up the empty landscape of his skin to prove there were no concealed weapons, no hidden intents. This was the code switching of the body, a silent language spoken fluently by those who are constantly watched. He softened the focus of his eyes, removing any trace of defiance or challenge, projecting instead a veneer of confused, youthful innocence. It was a performance of the highest caliber, acting for an audience of one, with the stakes being his life. He could hear the administrator's voice from behind the safety of the office door, shrill and muffled, continuing to narrate a fiction of danger, but Marcus did not react. To react to the lie would be to validate the tension. Instead, he let the accusation hang in the air, unanswered, allowing the contrast between the chaotic report and his statue-like calmness to do the work for him. When he spoke, he engaged the vocal equalizer in his throat. He pitched his voice slightly higher, stripping away the bass that naturally resonated in his chest, removing the grit and the depth that might signal manhood. He needed to sound like a child. He needed to sound like someone's son, not a suspect. "Yes, officer," he said, the words smooth and round, devoid of sharp edges. "I am waiting for my mother." The syntax was perfect. The grammar was impeccable. He did not use slang. He did not stutter. He offered no extraneous information that could be twisted into a probable cause. Every syllable was weighed and measured before it was released into the sterile air of the hallway. This was the tax he paid in real time, the expenditure of immense mental energy to manage the emotions of the adults around him. He was the one calming the situation, he was the one de-escalating the encounter, yet he was the one the system had labeled the threat. The absurdity of it burned in his stomach like swallowed acid, but his face remained a mask of polite compliance. He watched the officer's eyes scan him, looking for the monster he had been promised, looking for the rage, the weapon, the disrespect. But the officer found only a boy in a collared shirt, holding a hall pass that felt heavy as a brick in his pocket. The silence that stretched between them was heavy, filled with the ghosts of every similar encounter that had gone wrong in the history of the country. Marcus knew those stories. They were the bedtime warnings whispered by his father, the curriculum of caution taught alongside algebra and history. He knew that one wrong twitch, one sudden rise in volume, could shatter the fragile peace he was constructing. He felt the sweat trickling down his spine, a cold reminder of the fear he was suppressing, but he did not wipe it away. To wipe his brow would require moving his hand. Moving his hand was a risk he could not afford. So he let the sweat run, a private weeping of the body while the face remained stoic. The bodycam, that indifferent observer, recorded it all. The stillness of the student against the agitated backdrop of the school. The way the officer's stance slowly shifted from offensive to confused. The way the narrative of the threat began to dissolve upon contact with the reality of the boy. Marcus was winning, but it was a victory that felt like a defeat. He was successfully convincing them of his humanity, but the fact that he had to convince them at all, that he had to dial down the volume of his soul to be allowed to exist in a school hallway, was a tragedy that the camera recorded but could not understand. Dust motes dancing in shafts of afternoon sunlight were the only things allowed to move freely in his grandfather's workshop, a sacred geometry of oil-stained wood and disciplined silence that existed worlds away from the sterile, fluorescent violence of the school corridor. To understand why Marcus stood with such unnatural stillness while two armed officers flanked him, one must understand the architecture of that garage in late July, 3 years prior. It was there, amidst the scent of cedar shavings and WD-40, that the curriculum of survival was truly taught. It was not a singular lecture, often reductively referred to as the talk, but rather an apprenticeship in the art of becoming invisible while remaining entirely present. The bodycam footage captures Marcus blinking slowly, a physiological betrayal of the adrenaline flooding his system, but his mind had retreated to the workbench where his grandfather's hands, mapped with the topography of 80 years of labor, moved with deliberate, hypnotic grace. The lesson that day had not been about carpentry, though they were ostensibly repairing a chair leg. The lesson had been about the dangerous luxury of reaction. His grandfather had spoken in a voice that rumbled like a subterranean train, explaining that for men who looked like them, the world was an engine designed to extract a reaction, and that reaction would always be weaponized as justification for their destruction. This intergenerational transmission of trauma and tactic is invisible to the police lens. The camera sees a boy freezing up, perhaps interpreting his lack of cooperation as guilt or sullen defiance. The administrator, whose voice shrilled in the background about imminent threats and aggressive posturing, saw a monster of her own making. But the counter-story reveals that Marcus was not freezing. He was executing a high-level maneuver of emotional regulation that neither the administrator nor the officers possessed the capacity to understand. He was channeling the ghost of the workshop. He was remembering the weight of the hand plane, the way his grandfather taught him to smooth the rough grain not by forcing the blade, but by applying consistent, unyielding pressure. "Do not let them see you shake," the old man had said, wiping grease from a wrench with a rag that was cleaner than the shirt on his back. "If you shake, they think you are hiding something. If you run, they think you are guilty. If you speak, they think you are arguing. You must be a stone, Marcus. Stones do not give them anything to work with. Stones survive the river." In the hallway, the younger officer stepped closer, his hand hovering near his belt, his eyes darting between Marcus and the hysterical administrator. The officer was nervous. He was the one vibrating with kinetic energy, his training warring with his instincts, his fight-or-flight response triggered by a threat that refused to materialize. Marcus, by contrast, was the anchor. He had become the stone in the river. It is a profound irony of the American experience that the child is often forced to be the emotional stabilizer for the armed adult. The bodycam, if reviewed with an anthropologist's eye, documents this inversion of roles. You can see the officer seeking a reason to escalate, his body language begging for Marcus to twitch, to shout, to unclench his fists, just to release the tension that hung heavy in the air. But Marcus denied him that release. This denial was his inheritance. It was the legacy of great uncles who stood silently on sidewalks while patrol cars crawled by, of fathers who stared straight ahead at traffic stops while flashlights burned their retinas. This was not passivity. It was an active, muscular holding of the self, a psychological isometric exercise that burned calories and tore at the soul. The administrator's claim of a threat was crumbling against the fortress of this discipline. She had reported aggression, but the camera recorded only a monk-like composure. She had reported a disruption, but the only disruption was the chaos she herself was projecting. Marcus's silence was acting as a mirror, reflecting her own hysteria back at her, and she hated him for it. His grandfather had warned him of this too. "They will hate you for your quiet," he had said, placing the restored chair on the concrete floor. "They will call it arrogance. They will call it insolence. But they will walk away, and you will come home. That is the only victory that matters. Coming home." As the minutes on the Bodycam timestamp ticked by, the link between the boy in the hallway and the old man in the garage became the strongest force in the room. The officer's aggressive posture began to soften, not out of kindness, but out of confusion. The narrative he had been sold, of a dangerous, out-of-control youth, was incompatible with the reality standing before him. The legacy was working. The training was holding. But the cost of that training, the price of having to act as a stone at the age of 16, was a tax that would be levied against Marcus's heart long after the police walked away. The Bodycam saved the truth of the moment, but it could never capture the weight of the history that made the moment possible. The digital clock mounted high on the beige wall of the administrative office clicked over to the next minute, a silent metronome marking the passage of time in a room where the air had become thick enough to choke on. The silence that followed the initial chaos was not peaceful but heavy, charged with the static electricity of a narrative collapsing in real time. For the last 10 minutes, the school administrator had been painting a verbal portrait of a monster, describing a student who was volatile, aggressive, and threatening the safety of the campus. Yet the officers standing in the doorway were now looking at a boy who had not moved a single inch from the designated square of linoleum he occupied near the filing cabinets. The disconnect between the frantic voice on the dispatch radio and the stillness of the physical reality was beginning to grate on the nerves of the responding officers. This is the moment where the abstract concept of the receipt becomes a tangible, life-altering force. In the economy of racial interactions in institutional spaces, the receipt is the undeniable proof of conduct, the ledger that balances the accusation against the truth. Marcus had paid his taxes long before the police arrived. He had paid them in the currency of silence, in the rigid control of his facial muscles, and in the deliberate slowness of his breathing. Now, as the officers reviewed the situation, they were simply auditing the transaction. The lead officer, a man whose initial grip on his holster had been tight enough to whiten his knuckles, slowly moved his hand away from his belt, his eyes darting between the breathless administrator and the statue-like student. The Bodycam on his chest, a small black box with a blinking red eye, was capturing the most important testimony of the day, recording the chasm between what was said and what was true. The administrator sensed the shift in the room's temperature, that terrifying moment when authority realizes it has overplayed its hand. She began to backtrack, her voice pitching up an octave as she tried to retrofit her fear onto the scene. She spoke of tone, of posture, of the way Marcus had looked at her, attempting to convert subjective anxiety into objective threat. But the camera does not record feelings, it records physics. It records the distance between bodies, the volume of voices, and the presence or absence of weapons. The receipts were piling up against her. Every stuttered justification she offered was juxtaposed against Marcus's absolute refusal to give her the reaction she needed to validate her panic. If he had shouted, if he had thrown his hands up in frustration, if he had even rolled his eyes, he would have provided the visual syntax she required to make her story grammatical. By denying her that reaction, by holding fast to the training his grandfather had drilled into him in the garage, he starved her narrative of oxygen. The officers, trained to respond to escalation, found themselves with nothing to do but observe a young man who was more composed than the adults in the room. This is the moral victory, though it tastes like ash in the mouth. It is the victory of proving you are not a danger by suppressing your humanity until you are merely an object of observation. Marcus watched the realization dawn on the officer's face, the subtle relaxation of shoulders that signals the threat assessment has dropped to zero. It was a victory of logic over hallucination. The administrator had hallucinated a threat because her lens was cracked by bias, but the bodycam provided a corrective prescription. The officer turned to the administrator, his notebook flipping closed with a decisive snap that echoed like a gavel in the small room. He asked her to clarify where the threat was, his tone shifting from urgent protector to skeptical investigator. This interrogation of the accuser is a rare phenomenon, usually reserved for spaces where the accused has social capital, but here, the receipts were too overwhelming to ignore. The video evidence was being created second by second. Marcus knew that later, when this footage was pulled and reviewed, the timestamp would show exactly how long he stood there, hands visible, voice low, complying with commands that hadn't even been given yet. He was building a fortress of evidence around himself, brick by brick, using his own dignity as the mortar. The moral victory is not just in surviving the encounter, it is in exposing the lie without saying a word. It is forcing the system to look at itself in the mirror of that camera lens and see that the danger was never the boy in the hoodie. The danger was the fear that summoned the police in the first place. The officer finally turned his back on Marcus, not to dismiss him, but to address the administrator with a hushed, stern whisper that indicated the waste of police resources. In that moment, the power dynamic in the room inverted. The accuser became the liability. Marcus remained where he was, his internal world a storm of adrenaline that he refused to let surface, knowing that the camera was still rolling. He understood that the receipts were not just for the officers, they were for history. They were the documentation that in a world demanding his submission, he had offered something far more powerful, his perfection. He had out-disciplined the disciplinarians. As the officer signaled that Marcus was free to go, the relief did not wash over him like a cool wave. Instead, it settled on him like a heavy cloak. He had won the logic game. He had produced the receipts. But as he walked out of the office, past the stunned administrator and the confused officers, the tragedy of the moral victory became clear. He had to be perfect just to be considered harmless, while she was allowed to be reckless and still be considered an authority. The heavy thud of the car door sealing shut cut off the ambient noise of the school parking lot, creating a sudden vacuum of silence that felt louder than the sirens had been just an hour before. Marcus sat behind the wheel of his sedan, his hands gripping the leather at 10 and 2, not because he was driving, but because his body had forgotten how to stop bracing for impact. The engine was cold, and the dashboard lights flickered to life, casting a pale, artificial blue glow across his face, illuminating the exhaustion that had finally been granted permission to surface. He did not start the car immediately. Instead, he exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to expel the accumulated tension of every second he had spent in that office. He watched through the windshield as the last patrol car turned out of the lot, its lights off, disappearing into the mundane traffic of the late afternoon. The spectacle was over. The theater of safety had concluded its performance. To the outside world, this was a non-event, a misunderstanding cleared up by protocol and procedure. But inside the quiet sanctuary of his vehicle, Marcus understood that something fundamental had shifted in the tectonic plates of his reality. He loosened his tie, the fabric sliding against his collar feeling like a shackle being removed. He looked at his eyes in the rearview mirror. They were the same eyes that had stared down an administrator who viewed his existence as a provocation. They were the same eyes that had met the gaze of law enforcement without flinching. This was the final lesson, the one that no textbook in the building behind him could ever teach. It was the realization that the threat was never physical. The administrator had not called the police because she feared for her safety in a bodily sense. She had called them because she feared for the safety of her worldview. Marcus, with his calm articulation and his refusal to be small, had threatened the hierarchy she relied upon for comfort. His competence was the weapon. His dignity was the assault. The bodycam had not just recorded an interaction, it had captured the friction between a system designed to suppress and a spirit that refused to be compressed. As he finally turned the key and the engine purred to life, Marcus navigated the familiar route home, moving through the city with the deliberate caution of a man carrying something fragile. The streets were lined with the ordinary business of life, pedestrians waiting at crosswalks, shopkeepers sweeping sidewalks, children riding bicycles. It was a jarring juxtaposition to the high-stakes interrogation he had just survived. This was the burden of the counter-narrative, the requirement to oscillate between existing as a perceived danger and existing as a regular citizen, often within the span of a single heartbeat. The traffic lights turned from red to green, a rhythmic permission to proceed that felt almost mocking. He had been given permission to leave the office, permission to drive, permission to go home, yet he knew that his freedom was conditional. It was leased, not owned, paid for daily with the currency of his composure. Pulling into his driveway, the sanctuary of his home offered a different kind of silence. This was not the silence of a held breath, but the silence of peace. He walked to his front door, the keys jingling in his hand, a sound that usually signaled the end of the workday but today signaled the end of a war. Entering his living room, the familiar scent of old books and polished wood greeted him. He placed his briefcase on the table, the briefcase that contained the receipts, the emails, the proof of his innocence, and realized it was more than just luggage. It was a shield. He had survived because he was an archivist of his own life. The final lesson was that in a world committed to misunderstanding him, documentation was an act of resistance. He moved to the window, looking out at the fading light of the day. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. He thought about the officer's bodycam footage. Somewhere on a server, that digital file existed. It would likely be labeled unfounded or no incident. But Marcus knew the truth. That footage was a historical document. It showed a man standing in the center of a storm, refusing to get wet. It showed that the most radical thing he could do was remain utterly, terrifyingly calm. He had not just protected himself. He had protected the integrity of the truth. The victory was hollow, yes, because it should not have been necessary. But it was a victory nonetheless. He had forced the system to look at itself in the mirror of his behavior, and the system had blinked. Standing there, watching the night claim the neighborhood, Marcus felt the anger finally begin to dissipate, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. He would go back tomorrow. He would wear the suit. He would speak with the same precise diction. He would not shrink. The final lesson was not that he was safe. It was that he was formidable. The administrator had reported a threat, and in a way she hadn't intended, she was right. He was a threat to the lie that he was anything less than excellent. And as the streetlights flickered on, one by one, Marcus realized that being that kind of threat was the most honorable thing he could ever be.